Good afternoon. Can you hear me well? It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and I would like to begin by thanking my gracious hosts here for bringing me back. This is my 5th or 6th time at Notre Dame, so I risk, the more I write about moderation, the more I risk to be invited back, because there is so little of it in our world today. The question that I ask there is a serious one. Who is afraid of moderation? Because I think we all know this is $1 million question, and it is probably pointless, or it seems to me today, February 13th, 2025, utopian to speak about moderation as we are in the middle of a new administration, first 100 days, and the temperature of the political game is again very high, and it's likely to stay like this for a while. The stakes seem higher than ever, and the victory of one side is seen by the other as a grave existential threat to its own existence. For many, it seems that it's now or never. The most zealous believe that we are on an infamous Flight 93 path, and that we must do everything we can to prevent another earthquake. So the question that I ask, who needs the moderation today, is a difficult one to answer. I've written a lot about this topic, and I'm convinced that I should stop doing so, because the more I write, the less there is. And I must give you an advance warning, a trigger warning. This is the spirit of the age, trigger warnings. And my answer may not seem moderate at all at the end, because I will try to convince you that moderation can offer something that we really need today, a new mega movement. But wait a minute. It's not what you think. It will be make America governable again. That's the MAGA movement that I will try to suggest to you today. So the question is, do we really need moderation? And I will try to answer in the affirmative, but it's not that easy, because we have an image problem with moderation. It's obviously, I would like to remind everyone Barry Goldwater's words from 1964. Extremism in the pursuit of liberty is no vice. Moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. I should also remind you that he said those words in 1964, and then he was defeated at the polls in a significant election in 1964. I think that the situation today is different from 1964, for sure. Today we live in bubbles and echo chambers, and the democratic norms are undermined by politicians who exhibit an insatiable apetite for power. Moderation, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, never makes headlines in our cable news world and is conspicuously absent from the agenda of the majority of our politicians. You can't win primaries if you present yourself as a moderate. Under these circumstances, I think that practicing moderation seems utopian at best, and writing about it is also a risky endeavor in today's academia. But I want to suggest that it is a difficult and a dangerous enterprise, as the image of a tightrope walker that I'm going to share with you later would suggest. So the question that I think is worth asking, why is it such a difficult virtue here, and why being a moderate is like this tightrope walker hanging in the air, and the equilibrium is very unstable, to say the least. I think it's not that difficult to answer the question of why moderates have become a sort of endangered species in our politics and our society. It's no secret that moderation has an image problem in our world of fake news and alternative facts, dominated by echo chambers. Politicians who run for office in a climate dominated by hyperbole, hyper-polarization, and sectarianism have no need to present themselves as moderates to win re-election or election. As a matter of fact, they are keen to distinguish themselves from those who are still willing to work across party lines. Their mentality most often is my way or the highway. And this has fostered the appearance of what we all know by the name of cancel culture. Moderates have, moreover, been victims of ruthless primaries, gerrymandering, and public insults And they were challenged by opponents who campaigned by stressing purity tests and litmus tests. And this have become very prominent in our politics today. If you seem to be impure, you have no chance of being re-elected. So no wonder then that moderation carries the connotation of weakness, timidity, and indecisiveness. This is the image that we associate moderates with. On this view, moderation is practiced only by weak individuals unable to hold firm opinions and make strong decisions. Others equate moderation with opportunism. That's not good either, or see it as a symptom or an image of mediocrity and pettiness. According to this view, moderates lack moral principles, and they are too willing to endorse dubious compromises or defend an unsavory center that is devoid of substance. So this is certainly the view of prominent journalists like Rush Limbaugh, who once said, by definition, moderates can't be brave, quote, they don't have opinions, brave moderates, question mark, great moderates in American history, show me that book. And that was Rush Limbaugh about 15 years ago. So another view of moderation is that, and this is usually promoted from the left, is that it's never truly radical or democratic enough because it lacks a clear moral and political compass. And moderates, according to this view, never go far enough. According to this view, moderation amounts in practice to endorsing a status quo or condoning unpardonable forms of injustice. So those who embrace such a form of moderation do not really care on this interpretation about addressing injustice and reducing inequalities. And I want to remind you that this critique of moderation had some roots in the writings of Martin Luther King Jr., who denounced the moderation of the white men for good reasons, who are opposing civil rights activists at the time. So there's a declining faith in political institutions, and I think that everything that you see on that list that I've covered shows that it's very difficult to, let's say, be excited about moderation when you get this laundry list of criticism about moderation. So the problem for me as a historian of political thought, because this is what I've been doing for the last 25 years, is how can we study such an elusive and complex virtue? And I think that the question is a serious one for any political theorist here. And I think that not only one has to force oneself to be enthusiastic about moderation, but one has to learn how to study it properly. It's a multifaceted and complex virtue. It's different, in my view, from virtues such as justice, equality, or liberty. It's easy to write a theory of justice. It's virtually impossible, in my view, to write a theory of moderation. Because the nature and the complexity of moderation cannot be captured by using a purely philosophical or analytical approach. Something like John Rawls did in A Theory of Justice. It requires instead concrete historical examples and extensive historical forays that in turn demand thorough knowledge of various political contexts and actions. So I believe that we can only, if we are serious about this virtue, we can only write a history of various uses of moderation and of varying intentions with which it has been employed over time by actors placed in specific political, social, and cultural context. So in addition to that, I would like to point out that the richness of moderation can be grasped properly only if we place it within a larger semantic field, which includes related concepts. So it's impossible to study moderation independent from synonyms such as temperance, prudence, middle of the road, juste milieu, mixed or moderate government, and antonyms, opposites of moderation, such as fanaticism, extremism, radicalism, zealotry. In order to gain insight, in other words, into the worldview of moderates, we must examine also the radical and extremist ideas to which they responded and sought to reject. So as you can see, studying moderation requires a whole team of experts. It's not just one expert but it requires a whole team of scholars studying all of these related concepts, and I think that that is essential to point out at the very beginning. The other thing that I would like to add here is that it's an old concept with deep roots in classical political thought and in various religious traditions. So it's present in Christianity, of course, but also in Judaism, in Confucianism, and even in Islamic philosophy. Anyone familiar with the history of political thought should therefore realize that moderation represents an entire tradition of thought that transcends our classical categories of left or right. And I have come to the firm belief that it is an archipelago that has yet to be fully explored. An archipelago is a series of islands that are connected somewhat mysteriously underwater, and we don't see the connections between that. And this is how I conceptualize moderation here. This archipelago of moderation spans centuries and cultures and includes figures as diverse as Thucydides, Aristotle, even Plato could be added here, and Cicero, but also in early modern philosophy, Montaigne, Pascal, Montesquieu, Burke, or Tocqueville. So how to put all of these ideas and thinkers together is a monumental challenge for any historian of political thought. And I would like to show here one image that I like. It is a painting by Tizian. It's called The Allegory of Prudence. And the way in which I see moderation, I think, follows this tripartite structure that Tizian portrays in this beautiful painting that can be found in the National Gallery in London. These are three phases of prudence, according to Tizian: the young, the mature age, and then the old age. And you can see the differences between them and the animals under them that symbolize their power, strength, and wisdom. So I would like to point out that in order to study moderation, I think that it's fundamental to highlight the phases of moderation. Speaking of moderation in the singular, I've tried to convince you thus far makes little sense, but I think to add another layer of complexity to the story, I think we need to underscore the existence of at least three levels at which moderation can be studied. One is the ethical one, moderation as a mean between the extremes. And it is linked as such to prudence. It's the intellectual virtue ordered to truth in actions, and it helps us deliberate well about what is truly good and noble and directs the will to these ends like an arrow to its target. So moderation is therefore the moral virtue that prevents passions from blinding prudence and action. So this is the ethical virtue, and it is present in many classical authors. To this level of analysis, I would like to add two others. One is the institutional and the constitutional type of moderation. And it is very important to look at how moderation is translated into practice. And here we have principles and concepts such as separation and balance of powers, bicameralism, veto power, federalism, polycentricity. All of these concepts point to this institutional and constitutional structure of moderation. This is what embodies moderation in practice. So it makes little sense, in my view, to speak only about the ethical component of moderation without paying attention to the constitutional aspect. And I'm very happy that I'm speaking in the constitutional center, because this aspect of moderation is usually neglected or underestimated. And the third element that I like to point out here is the style or ethos of moderation. There's a certain style that characterizes the moderates. The moderates tend to be civil, tend to display humility, tend to be prudent. They are the opposite of the self-righteous confidence of providence, and they are the opposite of the zealous who want to annihilate their opponents. So, to make a long story short here, I like to remind everyone that most discussions today tend to focus on one or the other of these three levels, but anyone seriously interested in exploring the archipelago of moderation should take into consideration all three levels. And this is what I've tried to do to the best of my abilities in my books on this topic. Now, what's interesting here, as I said before, is that moderation is an old concept. And in the classical tradition, we do have a number of examples of moderation that I'd like to bring to your attention here. And I think Notre Dame is a proper place for that. Well, I like to start with the tradition of Confucianism, where moderation is very much central to understanding of what is a good life. In a book called The Doctrine of the Mean, written by someone in the circle of Confucius, it is written, the superior man embodies the course of the mean. The mean man, the man who acts according to the mean, acts contrary to the course of the mean. No, the mean man acts contrary to the course of the mean. The golden mean is a major image, aurea mediocritas, as a phase of moderation, and it appears obviously in the works of Aristotle, especially in the Nicomachean Ethics. A master of any art avoids excess and defect and seeks the intermediate and chooses the... Moderation can be found in the works of Plato and Seneca as a form of self-restraint and control of one's passions. More interestingly, at the institutional level, we find moderation as mixed government, mixed constitution, combining monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic elements. And this is the secret of the success of the Constitution of Rome, according to Polybius. Tacitus himself called moderation the most difficult lesson of wisdom. And I'm very happy that Professor Nigorski is in the attendance here, because the next slide has a quotation from Cicero. This is the famous image of Cicero as famous image of moderation as the choir. In playing the lyre or the flute, and of course in choral singing, a degree of harmony must be maintained among the different sounds, and if it is altered or discordant, a trained ear cannot endure it. And this harmony, through the regulation of very different voices, is made pleasing and concordant. So too the state, writes Cicero, through the reasoned balance of the highest and the lowest and the intervening orders, is harmonious in the concord of very different people. What musicians call harmony with regard to a song is conquered in the state, the tightest and the best bond of safety in every republic. And that concord can never exist without justice. Now, if we make the transition to early modern thought, we have here a number of authors to delight you with. We can say, without any exaggeration, that moderation is at the heart of Montaigne's essays, which I would describe as an apology of this virtue. And this is what Montaigne wrote in the essay on experience towards the end of Book 3. Our most glorious achievement is to live our life fittingly, and I translate à propos, which is the origin of French, with moderation. La Bruyère, in his Characters, writes of moderation as a divine virtue, and he adds to that everything that partakes of the extremes is imperfect and shares in the shortcomings of human beings, whereas moderation is a divine virtue. In his famous Pensées, Pascal writes, nature has placed us in the middle, and the greatness of human condition consists in knowing how to remain there. Finally, my favorite author of all on this list, Baltasar Gracian, a Jesuit, in Oraculo Manuali Arte de Prudencia, published in 1647, which is the book to read on prudence, relates moderation to prudence, and he mentions that it is moderation that gives us inner knowledge of moral truth in order to act and live well. I highly recommend this book by Baltasar Gracian, precisely because he is so little known today. But the best definition of moderation is yet to come, and it was given by 17th century Anglican theologian by the name Joseph Hall. By the way, this book, Christian Moderation, published in 1640, was actually republished last year, so you can find it on Amazon if you care to look for it. This is, in my view, the most beautiful definition of moderation: the silken string that runs through the pearl chain of all virtues. The silken string that runs through the pearl chain of all virtues. This is Joseph Hall in 1640. There are other images of moderation that I've come up with as I was trying to put all of these pieces of the archipelago together. The other one that I would like to call your attention has to do with trimming. Moderation as an art of balance, as an art of trimming. Trimming comes from the word to trim between the extremes, but it has a nautical component that is described in the Marquess of Halifax, the character of a trimmer. And he writes, this innocent word trimmer signifies no more than this, that if men are together in a boat and one part of the company would weigh down on one side, another would make it lean as much to the contrary. It happens that there is a third opinion of those who conceive it as it would do as well if the boat went even without endangering the passengers, keeping the ship on an even keel. The ship of the state is an old classical metaphor, and moderates are those who lean to one side or to another in order to preserve the equilibrium, the equipoise of the ship, to prevent it from capsizing. Now, this is 1684, but the political message, the political meaning of moderation becomes prominent and predominant only later, and I would say towards the mid-1700s. And it is during this time that moderation comes to be opposed to fanaticism and enthusiasm. So there is a long tradition of criticism of enthusiasm in the 18th century that starts with Shaftesbury, probably before Shaftesbury, certainly goes through Burke, and it's linked to toleration. So this is in the age of the Enlightenment, and it is certainly, I would say, important to highlight moderation as the antonym of fanaticism and political enthusiasm. And there are a few other names that could be added to this list. You have a critique of fanaticism in Voltaire, but also if you read the essays, the many essays in the Encyclopédie, which was the Wikipedia before Wikipedia in the 18th century, you see that there is this critique of fanaticism as a single-mindedness and a quest for purity. One thing that struck me as I was reading these essays, especially the one by Jaucourt, who was a contributor to the Encyclopédie along with Delaire, Diderot, and even Rousseau contributed one piece, is the idea that we have no duties towards those who think differently from us. This idea is present in the articles of the Encyclopédie that criticize fanaticism. All we have to do is to try to educate, re-educate, and convince those who think differently from us. And this idea has long roots in the 18th century. Now, the quintessential text that is central to any study of moderation is Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws. It's a long book, 507 chapters, 31 books. Nobody has read all of them. I challenge here, in good faith, if anyone can raise their hand and tell me that they've read all of the 507 chapters. I have not, okay? But I've been patient enough to stroll through, and I think I stopped at book 30. But anyway, in book 29, there is this wonderful quote. I've written this work, book 29, chapter 1. I've written this work only to prove it. The spirit of moderation should be that of the legislator. So you have to read 450 pages to get in book 29, chapter 1. What's interesting in Montesquieu's work is this link between moderation and institutional complexity. The idea that moderation presupposes mixture, equipoise, balance, and harmony, and discord, but all linked together. So there's a close relationship in Montesquieu's work between political liberty, moderation, security, and laws. And this is a kind of a red thread throughout his own work. And if you read what Montesquieu says, for example, in books 5 and 11, which are famous for this, Montesquieu proposes this concept of moderate government. Of course, he doesn't invent it. The classics knew about it. But there's something new in the way in which he conceptualizes moderation. And this is in book 5, chapter 14 of The Spirit of the Law. Montesquieu writes, one must combine powers, regulate them, temper them, make them act. One must give one power a ballast, so to speak, to put it in a position to resist another. As such, writes Montesquieu, moderate government is a work of art, a masterpiece of legislation that chance rarely produces and prudence is rarely allowed to produce. So Montesquieu's conclusion here is very interesting, and I think that for anyone following politics today, I think this is like a big warning. Here, therefore, is the fundamental constitution of the government of which we are speaking, he writes. As its legislative body is composed of two parts, so bicameralism, the one will be chained to the other by their reciprocal faculty of vetoing. The two will be bound by the executive power, which will itself be bound by the legislative power. As they are constrained to move by the necessary motion of things, they will be forced to move in concert. So what we have here in these two passages from books 5 and 11 of the Spirit of the Laws is the idea that moderation presupposes and works only within a framework of balance of powers and political pluralism, intermediary bodies, but also customs and mores, acting all in concert as tempering devices and, at the end of the day, prerequisites of freedom. So moderate government, as understood by Montesquieu, is based on the interdependence of mutually limiting powers and authorities. So you can have one power that is supreme in the state. Could that be executive power, legislative power, or the judiciary, which is the weakest of the three, Montesquieu said, then freedom is gone, kaput, finished. You need this constant fighting, constant balance. Rebalancing is I think, what he is after. Now, for those like Rush Limbaugh who believe that moderation never existed in America, I would like to point to three things here. One is the Federalist Papers, of course, where the word moderation, any search would give you at least 11 occurrences where the word appears. Moderation is equated here with open-minded reasonableness, a disposition to avoid extremes of action and expression. Reread George Washington's beautiful farewell address from 1796. And you'll see that moderation is presented there as a source of strength and a judicious approach that is essential for good government. And it depends, in order to be successful, on resisting intolerant extremes and zealotry. Now, another memorable quote can be found in John Adams' writings, and he is the one who said, "Without moderation, every man in power becomes a ravenous beast of prey." So this is towards the end of the 18th century. So I've given you this historical overview, perhaps too detailed, in order to remind you that we are talking here about an archipelago. It's a complex virtue. And it's time, I think, to draw some simple ideas from this historical foray. So you would ask, what do moderates stand for? Well, from what I've said thus far, moderates stand for a few things that are essential, in my view, to conceptualize this virtue. They stand for trimming between the extremes, the metaphor of trimming, keeping the balance of the ship of the state. They stand for a balance between freedom, justice, and solidarity. They advocate pluralism and diversity of ideas. They advocate and defend toleration. Most importantly, in my view, they oppose Manichaeism, the idea that the world is to be divided between the forces of the good and the forces of evil, fighting, there's no compromise between them. They oppose fanaticism and zealotry, and they defend the importance of dialogue and civility and compromise. Most interestingly, I think, moderates are those who embrace an ethics of responsibility because they take responsibility for their action. Now, you'd want to know whether moderate agendas existed or exist that embody these principles in action. And I would like to give you a few examples of moderate agendas, political agendas, philosophical ones perhaps, that exemplify this virtue. I'd like to start with one that I know best, which is the juste milieu doctrine in post-revolutionary France between 1815 and 1848, between revolution and between reaction. There was such a doctrine that actually was defended by the thinkers about whom I wrote in my doctoral dissertation 25 years ago. The second example would be the doctrine of ordo-liberalism. These are the thinkers, classical liberals and social Catholics, who combined put forward the doctrine of the social market economy, the soziale Marktwirtschaft. This is post-1945 Germany, and the success of the social market economy owes a lot to the ideas of thinkers such as Wilhelm Röpke and Alexander Rustov. The third example that I can give is the Prague Spring Movement of 1968, which the Czech-French writer Milan Kundera once called a revolt of the moderates. For those who study Eastern Europe and are curious to know how communism fell, Poland gives a good example. In Poland, in the mid-1970s, before Solidarity was founded in the 1980s, there was an institution called the Committee for the Defense of Workers, CORE in other words. And what they did was to put forward a doctrine of resisting communism in a gradual way by defending the rights of the workers who were dismissed or marginalized or penalized for that matter. And that led to the emergence of this oxymoronic phrase, self-limiting revolution, which is actually the doctrine that was espoused by the thinkers who were very influential in the Solidarity movement. This started in the 1970s, and the author that I like to mention here is Adam Michnik, who was very much he's still alive, was one of the heroes of the anti-communist resistance in Poland. Because I mentioned the Prague 68, I think echoes of moderation can be found in the Charter 77 that was an alliance between writers and dissidents in the 1970s in the former Czechoslovakia. And the author that I have in mind here is Václav Havel, who wrote a historic essay called The Power of the Powerless in 1977 that describes this moderate agenda that I have in mind. Well, there are two other examples that are worth mentioning here. One is the doctrine of the third way. Towards the end of the 1990s in Europe and the United States to some extent, there was this idea that there's a third way between, I would say, capitalism and socialism. And Tony Blair is the example that could be given here in response to these moderate agendas. But there was also a movement in the United States and in Germany under the Chancellor Gerhard Schröder. Now, finally, you may not know that Sweden has a moderate party, Moderaterna, which was founded in 1903. It's a classical liberal agenda. They have been in cahoots with some right-wing anti-immigration movement lately, so their image has suffered a lot. But I think that the existence of this party shows that you can actually have a party that calls itself the Moderate Party and is successful. The Moderate Party in Sweden gave the country a prime minister, or maybe two, but at least one that I know of. And I think that it's very important to list it as an example of moderation. So this is the optimistic part of my talk, because now I'm changing hats here and I'm becoming a pundit with your permission. So where are we today? Okay, so there are some good news and bad news. Let's start with this. George Orwell wrote, I think in 1939, he said, "We have sunk to a depth at which the restatement of the obvious is the first duty of intelligent man." And this is how I feel today when I write about moderation. I feel that I'm restating what is obvious, what is commonplace, commonsensical, and yet nobody pays any attention, with the exception of the present audience here. Moderation rarely figures on the list of proposed remedies for overcoming hyperpolarization. And you've seen in the last few years proposals such as the Green New Deal, abolished ICA, defund the police, the 1619 project, and the 1776 project. All examples, in my view, of immoderation. So I'd like to give you some good news here. I'm not sure we should always mention the bad news here, but there is some room for moderation, even in our age, in our agenda. In 1980, only 40 years ago, moderates accounted for 60% of the US Senate, okay? I will let you count them today. I think one hand would be enough. A little over 40% of the so-called independents today tend to be moderates on one or more dimension, and 37 to 39% of moderate registered voters define themselves as moderates. 70% of moderates would like to see a third major party. Civil society is still strong in this country. You probably have heard of some of these organizations. I have heard of them as I was writing my book. Otherwise, I would have never known about them. Braver Angels. Is anyone familiar with this institution? It's a great organization founded in 2016. Initially, they were called Better Angels, but then someone was upset and they were asked to change their name. There's a think tank in Washington called The Third Way. There's another one called No Labels that had some bad press in the last few years. But there's a great organization called the American Exchange Project, which does something that nobody else does, which means funds young men and women from Kansas to go and spend a month with a family in Boston, and then takes kids from Maine or New York and sends them to Oklahoma. So you can get the picture here. More in Common is another organization that I'm very, very interested in, and Hidden Tribes, Not Tribes, and the Heterodox Academy. So all of this, I think, is meant to suggest that there are reasons for optimism here, and despite America's hyperpolarization, the middle may be far larger than you and I think. There is such a thing like exhausted majority. And I think that the benefits of moderation are real. I'm going to make a few comments on some of these points. There are 2 slides on it. I don't see moderation as an ideology, which is a plus in my view, because it has affinities with both liberalism and conservatism. It can accommodate a wide variety of ideas and forms of government. And it refuses to define one single best way. And it makes us aware that the political good is multi-dimensional. There's not one dimension. In other words, when we define what is the good society, we can't just elevate one single principle. That could be justice, could be freedom, could be equality, could be anything, and elevate it to the rank of supreme values. You need to find a balance between that, and that's what moderates do. And in so doing, I think they promote a flexible, pragmatic, and a skeptical mindset that is so essential, in my view, to anyone practicing politics, because it avoids fixation on one single good value on principle. It promotes also commitment to dialogue, which is so essential, again, to the existence of our representative institutions. And also important, in my view, is that moderation promotes gradualism, or gradualism promotes moderation. I don't know how to make it appear here best, but it seems to me that piecemeal reform allows for new ideas to be tried, evaluated and honed over time. Learning by trial and error always is helpful, and errors can be corrected. And this is the mindset of the moderates, that piecemeal reform is better than revolution, step-by-step corrections. So in an immoderate moment, I would like to conclude with some rules for radical moderates, because I do believe that moderation is a radical virtue. It's a virtue that is eminently suited to our time, in spite of the fact that there are so few moderates today. So that's the paradox. Okay. So what radical moderates do, they refuse to believe that there are panaceas to our complex social and political problems. They refuse to define one single best way. Instead, they examine the facts, and they are prepared to amend and nuance their beliefs when facts change. The example that I would like to give here is actually very, very close to my heart. It's inspired by my late colleague Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009. Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize because she showed that sometimes it's the market, sometimes it's the state, sometimes there are cooperative associations that solve problems. There's no panacea. That was one of her favorite phrases. No panaceas. You have to combine this It depends on the level where these things are applied. So you can't have just healthcare, single payer healthcare for a country of 340 million people, 50 states. It's just impossible. There are different ways of solving this problem. This is not to say that we shouldn't have healthcare. It's just to say there is no single solution to this problem. Avoid echo chambers is the second rule, and do not be sectarians. Always try to think politically in the sense that you try to balance rather than ideologically. Keep the lines of the dialogue open with your opponents. The third rule is simple. Start working with the world as is. Don't be perfectionist. Defend piecemeal reforms rather than utopian blueprints for change. I've been the chair of my department for 1.5 years now, so I know that this is the most important rule, okay? I start with what I have, and I'm not a perfectionist by any stretch of my imagination. Do not become obsessed with axis of evil, with purity, with red lines or litmus tests. Resist the temptation to divide the universe between the forces of the light, forces of light and forces of darkness. And finally, no particular belief should hurt you in political life. So if you enter the political realm, the public realm, you have to admit that most of our problems have more than one side, and we need to defend eclecticism. We need to embrace eclecticism and fusionism. And I think this is what we need today. To make a long story short, what I try to suggest to you today with a long historical detour is that moderation is a magnetic idea or can be a magnetic idea. It's properly understood, it's a muscular and a radical virtue, not a lukewarm one, as its critics suggest. It doesn't endorse existing unjust hierarchies. And I think that moderation can offer us the new mega that we so badly need today. And this is the mega that I'm going to end with: make America governable again.
Thank you so much. My name is Michael Kennedy. I'm a junior here studying classics. And I find your talk really, really interesting, so thank you. I guess my question kind of pushes back a little bit against your point, though. Maybe to introduce a principle that is the one principle that kind of supersedes all of them is like truth. And I guess my proposition is that truth isn't always right down the middle. I think Aristotle says that like the middle is not always is not the correct mean. It's sometimes you go on either side. So I guess my question is, right now in our culture, you mentioned polarization. Is the moderate path necessarily the right one if one side is more at fault than another, if the truth is actually on one end of the spectrum? So I feel like I don't know if you have any response to that.
Well, thank you. It's a difficult question, the one you're asking, and it requires a complex answer. I cannot give you, so I'm going to give you a simplified one. I'm trying to talk here about moderation as a political virtue. As you remember, I emphasize the institutional component of moderation and the spirit of moderation. So I start from the assumption that we all aspire to truth, but none of us can claim direct access to truth. If any one of us claims to have direct knowledge of the truth, then that person is likely to become a zealot. And I think that moderates offer us a kind of a warning signal. Do not be too cocky. Do not be too self-assured that you know the truth. Listen to your opponents. Listen to other opinions. And maybe you'll make it closer to the truth, but don't be so sure. And I think that that's the spirit of the virtue that I mentioned. They never say there's no truth. The relation between truth and moderation is a complex one. And I think that if you look at some of the examples here, for example, Pascal was certainly a Christian, and he also thought that the greatness of human condition is to keep itself in the middle, because we tend to go overboard. So as a ethos, as a style, I think moderation can offer us a kind of countervailing force, countervailing virtue, if you wish, to the self-righteousness the idea that, yeah, there is only one way of looking at things. So when I look at today's world, I'm baffled because I don't understand much of what's going on. I don't have the information, okay? And I don't know the history of some of the problems. So as a moderate, I think it would be proper, though I'm not a moderate, but as a moderate, it would be proper precisely to bring this spirit of doubt. I would remind you of a wonderful saying by the Polish writer Czesław Miłosz. Miłosz wrote a major book called The Captive Mind. And there he gives the saying of a rabbi who said, if you find someone who claims to be 50% of the time right, then you are lucky, you should thank God. If you find someone who is 60% times right, you are God's chosen vessel there. If you find someone who claims to be 75% time right, then something is fishy there. And if it's 90 or 100%, then that's a zealot, so you should flee from that and stay away from that. So I'm in the 50% category.
Right over here.
Hello, thank you for coming. My name is Mercedes. I'm a sophomore studying political science and theology. And I appreciate the virtue of moderation very personally in the character sense and in a personal application of that virtue. But as a civic virtue, I hesitate to accept it so quickly because I think there are strengths to making sure there is people who have strong support for either side, because I think that is necessary for those people to come together and discuss differing opinions. If your advice is to encourage moderation as a civic virtue across all people engaging in civic life, do you think there is possibly a danger of too much of a center party? Do you think that possibly, if this were to be taken to, if maybe this is a little bit hyperbolic, but if there's an extremism in moderation, do you think that proposes a danger to our country of too much of a centrist movement where we don't have the same diversity of opinions that make our country so ready for progress and success?
Okay. I thought I wrote a utopian book, but listening to your proposal, you're worried that we have too much of a center, then I'm sure that there could be one. It's a difficult question to answer seriously. And I do think that certainly we shouldn't all be moderates. So I wrote this book as a form of dialogue between a moderate and two radicals. One on the right, I gave him the name Rob. He reads the first things, whatever. Claremont Review books. And one from the left, I gave her the name Lauren. She reads the Jacobin, N+1. And I try to engage in a dialogue with people precisely because I think that moderation doesn't have answers to all of these problems. And I think that a degree of radicalism is necessary, is absolutely necessary in our society, because to be radical means to go to the root of the problem. This is the meaning of radicalism, to go to the root of the problem. So I think that's clear. We cannot all be moderates. We shouldn't be all moderates. So I don't think that there's a danger in that. What I try to argue against is that image of moderation that is so prevalent, like indecisiveness, lack of vision, condoning unjust hierarchies, things like that. And I do think that at the end of the day, the moderates should be rare in our society. And I don't think it takes the whole Senate to be moderate, but it would be good if we had like 10 moderates in the Senate. They would, imagine what would that be? They would really hold the balance of power if there were 10. So people who would not be beholden to, partisan identities. But that's the utopia that I dream of. Not that we all should be moderates, but we need a modicum of moderate.
Thank you. My name is Liam Reynolds. I'm a freshman here studying political science, and I'd like to think that I resonated with a lot of the things that you said, so thank you for that. Especially when you brought up like the founding fathers like George Washington and John Adams and how they really emphasized early on the importance of moderation. However, at least from my view, I feel like a common objection to at least the founding fathers and their argument about moderation could be related to their views of the success of like social movements, for example, that have been previously considered as radical, primarily the role of women's rights and the civil rights movement. Obviously, you know, not all men could even own property or even vote when the Constitution was ratified. So when we look back at those movements and kind of like the success of the civil rights and women's rights movements, and I think there would be a common consensus here that the United States is better off because of those movements and like how they have been previously considered radical. Where do we draw the line or even like welcome the ideas of what we consider radical today, knowing that there are previous examples in history of like how the definition of radicalism has evolved into gradual acceptance?
Yeah, thank you. Excellent question and a difficult one as well.
We're not going to give you easy ones.
No, it's good, and I think that this only shows the complexity of the virtue, because you cannot understand moderation if you don't understand radicalism. That's what I said at the beginning, and I'm committed to that view. And I've been accused, by the way, of mischaracterizing the radicals in my book. So you can read and see for yourself if that's the case or not. But I do think that there are different types of errors, so to speak. So if we try to glorify the founding fathers for having had access to the truth and having seen everything perfect, nothing has to be changed. We need to go to the original interpretation of what they thought then. I don't think that works. I think that's not going to solve our problems. On the other hand, I don't embrace Jefferson's idea that every generation should write its own constitution either. So can we find a middle of the ground, middle of the road between the two views? I think so. Let's take the two projects, 1619 project and 1776 project, okay, which was passed in 2020. So both projects are radical in my view, but radical in the wrong sense. One is that tries to, change our understanding of the beginning of the country in a way that is not correct. Major historians from left and the right and center have dismissed that narrative. The country was founded in 1776. There were Puritans before that, of course. And there was slavery before that. But the revolution was not fought in order to defend the slavery, which is the idea of the 1619 project. The 1776 project goes overboard in the other direction that I mentioned earlier. So I think that we need to find a way to look for a middle ground between that. And I quoted Martin Luther King's critique of the moderation of the white man because I think it's pertinent to this. He was right to criticize that because sometimes moderation is invoked to defend unequal, unjust, and frankly, unacceptable hierarchies and forms of injustice. So I think that's the spirit of moderation. It requires discernment, judgment, how to judge. Where is this middle ground, which is shifting? It's not in the middle, it's a mean. It could be sometimes to the left, sometimes to the right. And that's why I end up defending in the book the need for eclecticism. Now, to be an eclectic politician is a death sentence because we need to be realistic. Political parties matter, they rule the day. But I think that as academics, for example, we can be eclectics, and I think we can defend that virtue.
Next question. Right back here, and then I'll go next.
My name's John Luke Cohnhout. I'm a PhD student here in Constitutional Studies. Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. My question is about the relationship between institutional moderation and the ethical moderation, also maybe the kind of ethos of moderation you talked about as well. I think some people you mentioned, such as Aristotle or the authors of the Federalist Papers would not be surprised at our radical polarization today, because in their minds they would see that our government has kind of strayed into extremes of democracy. Kind of since the progressive movement in the early 20th century, there's been a push towards more and more democratic forms of governance. And so some of these thinkers on institutional moderation might think that that decline of institutional moderation and a push towards an extreme form of democracy could actually give rise to more and more polarization and a decline in ethical moderation. So would you agree with that assessment? And if so, how would you respond to that? Because one might think that advocating for less democracy is perhaps even more suicidal than advocating for moderation.
Thank you for your question. One of the authors that is studied seriously at Notre Dame and also at Indiana, I should add, is Alexis de Tocqueville. Tocqueville saw democracy as kind of an ongoing process. He said democracy's roots can be traced back to the 12th century, so in 1100s. He was writing this in the 1830s. So he came to the conclusion that democracy, in order to be appreciated for what its real virtues are, needs to be appreciated with moderation. In other words, sometimes you need to apply moderation even to the love for democracy. Democracy in America, he says in a famous chapter, does not give us the best politicians. He said it, not me. He also reminds us that democracy doesn't bring us the best legislators or laws. It brings the passions of the mob to the surface. So, you know, he has a chapter in which he says, what do you want? You want great poetry, great dramas, great operas, aristocracy, great manners. If you want fewer crimes, more prosperity, more stability, then democracy. So that's the spirit in which I think democracy has to be appreciated. Democracy is not a panacea and should never be. So there are moments when, in order to love democracy well, you need to love it with moderation. In other words, you need to lean into the other side in order to correct its errors, to purify it from its excesses and so forth. So I think that's one of the things that Tocqueville would say in answer to this question. Now, I think that we are in a cycle here. There's a reaction to the excesses of democracy that risks to take us in the opposite direction and make it less democratic than it is. So I think that the wisdom lies in finding a middle ground between too much democracy and too little democracy. And I think that we are moving into a too little democracy moment now. But I may be wrong.
Bill, you've had your hand up for a while.
Thanks so much. Very engaging talk. Appreciate the desire for moderation and look on examples like Christian democracy in post-war Europe as a sort of wonderful example, perhaps, of how it operated in certain contexts, particularly coming out of the awful first half of the 20th century in Europe. But my question relates back to Michael's in some ways. Are there issues in which, or areas in which moderation works better than others? So there might be issues, you've already mentioned them a couple of times, Martin Luther King Jr. and civil rights, in which moderation was being used against justice, against a just settlement. I would put forth, of course, abortion as an issue where there isn't an easy, moderate solution. It's either a baby or it isn't in the womb. Where's the sort of moderate compromise? Now, I do think there's a way in which politicians can work their way in a moderate way to the just end. Are there issues in which ultimately you have to get at the truth And having moderation as the course of action is a sort of barrier to getting towards a just settlement.
Yeah, could be, and that's why I want to reiterate what I said over and over again, that it's not a panacea. So I acknowledge the difficulty of the issue of abortion because it's a difficult question. There are ways in which you could complexify this topic. The way in which you presented it, in my view, tends to simplify it. It's one way or another. I think that there are ways in which you can look at, for example, do we need also to give maternity leave, 6 months, a year to women? We need health care as a social right. So I think that all of these issues need to be integrated, and childcare, of course. So all of these issues have to be integrated into a larger issue, larger framework here. I come from a country that banned abortion for 1967 to 1989, and I saw that was not a solution either, Romania. And I think there's a great movie, by the way, 432, which I recommend, that speaks to this issue. So this is a very complex topic that I think when it's politicized, it tends to be simplified for quick political gain. So I think that what I try to suggest is that for most of these issues, we need to complexify this, the way in which we think about these issues, so that we resist the temptation of finding quick solutions to them. So I'm interested in the culture around these issues, the ethos, the norms, how we argue about it. So I think that would be my first instinct. But you know, I side with Martin Luther King Jr. here when he said the moderation of the white man was wrong, was a way to deny civil rights, extension of civil rights to the population. So that's clearer in a way. But most of the issues seem to me complex, and they need to be complexified rather than simplified.
How do you determine which issues are clearer and which aren't?
I don't know. I really don't know.
Young lady right up here.
Is it on? Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So I'm a 25-year campaign veteran, and I could go so many different directions, but I want to talk about complexity, which did appear a couple times in the slides.
Yeah, I wish I could go back, but this doesn't move easy. Yeah.
And given, that the founding fathers had a bit of a blank slate, and some of the other countries that you mentioned are much smaller, and we compare that to our current situation, the current government, the size and complexity of the U.S. government, and I think in a very real way that we're discovering in the last few weeks just how complex it is, I find it really hard to imagine moderation without a simplification of the government. It would certainly be much easier if things were less complex, and I think you would agree with that.
Well, you'll be surprised to know that I do not, and I try to think the history of political thought along a different dimension. So there are those who think that the political good is easy to identify, and there are those who present a complex view of it. So Rousseau, for example, was a simplifier, and Montesquieu was a complexifier in this regard. So for Rousseau, political good was simple, the general will. For Montesquieu, it was the English Constitution, which notoriously was hated by Rousseau, by Thomas Paine, and by Karl Marx. So there are those who like simple solutions, and those who trust simplicity, and those who like complex solutions and trust complexity. So I do think that complexity, Montesquieu's quotation, if I can get to it, it's actually the one that I want to get to. It is, I think, the answer to your question. So I want to go back to I'll get to it. So if you look at these two paragraphs there, the two quotes, I think they show why he likes complexity. So I think that in a complex system like ours, there is more room for compromise, more room for friction, more room for temperings, and more room for concord. than we tend to believe. So it would be simple if it were easy, but I like the fact that the judicial power is so complex, and the executive power seeks to overstep its boundaries.
The complexity I'm talking about is the amount of money flowing through the system, the parties, and not political parties, but the people involved in the system creating corruption, waste, etc., that are
I see.
not the actual, not the way that
Yeah.
the government is set up, but how it's actually being operated.
Yeah,
and that degree of complexity.
Yeah, I agree.
In the way.
I agree, but I was fixated on this because I think that that's the fundamental point. And what we do with this, of course, we are human beings.
Yeah.
Back here.
Thank you. It's an inspiring talk. So you mentioned your Romanian background. I was born and grew up in Sweden, where
Lucky
the
you.
example of Moderaterna, the political party, which is to the right, but it's here portrayed as a moderate, an expression of moderation, which is news to me. I'm not going to argue with that classification, but I found it very appealing. The idea and the way I interpret moderation in your talk is as a political virtue, and for people in decision making decisions for the collective or polities, to act some self-restraint and be more humble, perhaps a certain degree of humility, to not be able to say that I know the truth and they're wrong, to kind of refrain from that kind of behavior. But that's different than just a general virtue of saying that everything is okay, I'll just go with the middle of the road.
Absolutely.
And so I just wanted to say, is that consistent with your interpretation of what moderation is needed is mostly for collective decision making and not necessarily just always go with the mean middle of the road?
Absolutely, Crystal. So you summarized the way in which I wanted to convey the message. It's not always in the middle. That's why I end with radical moderation, because you have to go left, you have to go right, and you have to have the courage of your opinions. So the moderates that I presented here, Adam Michnik, for example, he is a moderate of the left. Okay. So he came from, he actually advocated for the solidarity between the Catholic Church and the left in Poland in 1960s and 1970s. So that was a courage of his conviction. Václav Havel stood up to the communist authorities. So it was in the middle of the road, absolutely. And I think that there's one of the images of moderation as identified always with the center is wrong. I think it's simplified. It's a simplified version of moderation. You can, there are moderates on the left, moderates on the right. In communist Romania, we try to imagine that we knew better than others. So for us, there were no moderates on the left. And I think that this is still an image among my compatriots, that there can be no moderation on the left. And I try to resist that. I think that in one of my previous books, I write about the Italian political theorist Norberto Bobbio, a great constitutionalist that I recommend to everyone interested in constitutionalism. Bobbio was a moderate of the left who was not a communist, who actually engaged in dialogue with communists, but told them, you are defending an utopia that will end in tragedy. On the right, my hero is Raymond Aron. Raymond Aron was a distinguished French sociologist, professor, and journalist. And he also had the courage of conviction. He engaged in a dialogue with Jean-Paul Sartre and defended a kind of form of moderation that was very iconoclastic. He was a friend of de Gaulle, but also a critic of de Gaulle. Okay? So I think that those are the figures that I think exemplify the complexity of moderation. I want to go back to the idea, yeah, they were committed to the truth, but they were not sure they would get to the truth. And I think that separates them from the confidence of providence. This is Raymond Aron's phrase, those who believe they have access to the divinity and have access to the final solutions. And I think that in politics in particular, that's the greatest danger. to imagine that you have the solution to this. So I think this form of epistemic humility, which is, by the way, ingrained in the Swedish version of the concept lagom, I think neither too much nor too little. I don't know why I praised the Swedes today. I didn't have anything prepared specially, but it's in the book. So that idea of lagom, neither too much nor too little, leave something for others to share with you. I think that's the spirit of moderation.
Our last question, Brooke.
Hi, I'm Brooke. I'm a senior here. Thank you so much for coming and giving your talk. I've really enjoyed it. I think a question I have, it's not even a question. It's more so like asking you for advice, and it's not on our government, but more so like civil society that we have here at Notre Dame. I mean, I think a reason I came to Notre Dame was I was drawn into the passions of other students here, even if they're wildly different from my own. And so much of this talk was kind of like asking how do we have passions, but maintain them in a way that prevents us from not practicing temperance at the same time. So at a school with students with so much passion and so much drive, what advice would you be willing to give them on how to maintain that passion and maintain the drive while not preventing us from being moderate and having prudence and temperance and all those other virtues that you're also promoting?
Thank you. I love this question. And I'm going to talk to students later this afternoon, so I'm exercising, including you. I think that first and foremost, it's important to understand when it comes to politics, because you are talking about political passions and social, that most of these issues have a history of engagement with them. There's a history of failed attempts and successful attempts to deal with them. So the first advice would be learn history, so that you don't start from scratch. You stand on the shoulders of giants. One of the ideas that inspired me in preparing this presentation for today was to give you this impression that we are literally standing on the shoulders of giants. And if we have any original ideas, we are very lucky, but we don't. What we can do, most of the time, however, is to admire what the best of humanity has to give us. And I've always been inspired by one of Seneca's letters to Lucilius in his Epistolae Morale, in which he says, look at the library, and all of those people are dead, but they are there waiting to engage in a conversation with you and give you the best that humanity has to offer. All you have to do is open the book and the dialogue is there. They are ready day and night. And I want to remind you a beautiful letter written by Machiavelli to his friend Francesco Vettori. He says that when he comes home at night, he takes off the garments that he wore over the day. They are mud and spotty and dirty. And he puts the royal garments and he enters into the courts of the ancients. He reads them and he engages with them for hours. He forgets about his worries, misery, poverty, death, lost friends. And he forgets all of that and he engages with the best of mankind. So I think that cultivating that passion, I think is essential to being a good student today. That motivates you. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You stand on the shoulders of giants. The giants are there in any library. Open and inspire yourself from them.
My friends, we have reached the end of our time together. Let's go ahead and please join me in thanking.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aurelian. Wonderful.